This is the story of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the man who outlasted everyone who tried to kill him and ended up ruling Japan for it. He spent his childhood as a hostage, watched two of history's most famous warlords rise and fall around him, and won the country not by being the strongest man in any given room, but by being the one still standing when everyone else had destroyed each other. Ieyasu was born in 1543, the same year European traders introduced firearms into Japanese warfare. His birth name was Matsudaira Takechiyo, and he would change it several times before settling on the Tokugawa name history remembers. His father, Matsudaira Hirotada, ruled Okazaki Castle as head of the Matsudaira clan in Mikawa province. His mother, Odai no Kata, was the daughter of a neighboring samurai lord. Both parents were teenagers when he was born, his father 17, his mother 15. The trouble started almost immediately. The same year Ieyasu was born, the Matsudaira clan split, when Hirotada's uncle defected to the powerful Oda clan, and Oda Nobuhide used that defection as an excuse to attack Okazaki. Hirotada's father-in-law died not long after, and his successor joined the Oda side too, which meant Hirotada had to divorce Odai no Kata and send her back to her own family to preserve what alliances he had left. She would go on to have 11 more children through later marriages, all of them Ieyasu's half-siblings. Squeezed from every direction, Hirotada turned to his powerful eastern neighbor, Imagawa Yoshimoto, for military support. Yoshimoto agreed, on one condition. Hirotada had to send his young heir to the Imagawa domain as a hostage, a guarantee written in flesh that Mikawa wouldn't switch sides. Oda Nobuhide found out about the arrangement through his spy network and struck first. He had the 5-year-old boy abducted before the handover could happen, then threatened to execute him unless Hirotada cut ties with the Imagawa entirely. Hirotada refused. He said that sacrificing his own son would prove exactly how serious his commitment to the alliance really was. Nobuhide didn't kill the boy, but he didn't let him go either. He kept Ieyasu captive for 3 years. Sometime during that captivity, legend has it, the 6-year-old hostage met a 14-year-old named Oda Nobunaga. A meeting neither of them could have known would matter as much as it eventually did. In 1549, Hirotada was murdered by men sworn to serve him, bribed with Oda gold. The same instability that had broken his family now spread to the people who'd broken it. 2 years later, Oda Nobuhide himself died of disease, and the Oda clan immediately split into a succession fight. Nobuhide's illegitimate son Nobuhiro took refuge in a castle that the Imagawa besieged almost at once. The man who saved him was Nobuhide's actual heir, the same Nobunaga who'd once met young Ieyasu as a child. Nobunaga negotiated a deal with the Imagawa that ended the siege, and the price was Ieyasu himself, now 9 years old, handed over once again, this time into Imagawa custody as a hostage in his own right. He spent the next 5 years in the Imagawa stronghold of Sumpu, from age 9 to age 14, watched but reasonably well treated, learning what it meant to survive as a pawn in other men's wars before he'd ever fought one of his own. When Ieyasu came of age, Imagawa Yoshimoto personally presided over his coming-of-age ceremony, and the newly adult samurai traveled back to Okazaki to pay respects at his father's grave and take command of the Matsudaira retainers still loyal to his bloodline. He was 15. He married Lady Tsukiyama, a noblewoman connected to the Imagawa line, and the following year their son Matsudaira Nobuyasu was born. There was no peace waiting for him at home. The Imagawa, recognizing his battlefield potential, called him back into service almost immediately, and in 1558, still a teenager, Ieyasu personally led his first assault at the Siege of Terabe Castle. 2 years later, the conflict that had shaped his entire childhood reached its breaking point. Imagawa Yoshimoto marched a massive army along the Tokaido Highway, intending to push all the way to Kyoto and challenge the crumbling Ashikaga shogunate directly, while Ieyasu's forces besieged an Oda fortress as part of that campaign, using newly introduced European firearms to kill the garrison commander with concentrated fire. Nobunaga did something nobody expected. Rather than meet the massive Imagawa army head-on, he led a small surprise strike directly at Yoshimoto's main column while it marched through his territory. The afternoon was brutally hot, and many of the Imagawa soldiers had taken off their armor to celebrate what they assumed were already secured victories. Nobunaga's force broke through and killed Yoshimoto where he stood. The Battle of Okehazama ended the Imagawa clan's dominance in a single afternoon. With his old hostage master suddenly dead and the Imagawa clan thrown into disarray, Ieyasu saw his opening. He marched his loyal retainers back to Okazaki Castle and reclaimed his birthright, formally allying himself with the man he'd once met as a captive child. The two former enemies had become friends. That alliance came with a complication. Ieyasu's wife and infant son were still hostages in Sumpu, held by Yoshimoto's son and successor, Imagawa Ujizane. Recovering them required deception. In 1562, Ieyasu laid siege to Kaminogo Castle and commissioned a young retainer to lead a stealth raid under cover of darkness, setting fire to the castle and capturing the lord's own sons as leverage, which Ieyasu then traded for his wife and child. That retainer's name was Hattori Hanzo, and this raid was the start of a partnership between the two men that would end, 17 years later, in something far darker than a daring nighttime raid. Ieyasu's reputation as a battlefield commander was cemented at the Battle of Azukizaka in 1564, fighting against the Iko-Iki, a league of militant Buddhist monks, ronin, and peasants who'd organized against samurai taxation of their temples. Some of Ieyasu's own retainers defected to the rebellion out of religious sympathy, but he personally took the field, issuing challenges to enemy samurai and fighting in the front line, where bullets pierced his armor without killing him. His visible courage under fire convinced several of the defectors to switch back. By 1567, with his reputation as master of Mikawa province secured, he adopted the Tokugawa name, claiming descent from the Minamoto clan, one of Japan's oldest and most prestigious bloodlines, the same lineage history required of anyone who wanted to one day call himself shogun. For a while, Ieyasu maintained his alliance with Nobunaga, while also forging a separate agreement with Takeda Shingen, the formidable lord of Kai province, splitting territorial gains between them as the Imagawa domains collapsed. The arrangement fell apart through Ieyasu's own maneuvering. When the Imagawa heir Ujizane found himself besieged and desperate, Ieyasu negotiated his surrender by offering help reclaiming lost territory, then immediately abandoned his deal with Shingen and aligned instead with Shingen's rival to the north, Uesugi Kenshin. Shingen, feeling betrayed, broke his own alliance and began campaigning directly against Ieyasu. By October of 1572, Takeda Shingen made his move, marching 20,000 of his own men plus reinforcements out of his capital and into Totomi province, brushing past Ieyasu's defenses with little resistance. Nobunaga, not wanting an open break with Shingen himself, urged Ieyasu to simply retreat to Okazaki and let the Takeda army pass through unchallenged. Ieyasu refused outright. "A man who would retire like that has no business to call himself a warrior," he told his council, and led his forces out to a plain called Mikatagahara to block the road. It went badly almost immediately. Ieyasu's own military inspector warned him the Takeda numbers were overwhelming and advised waiting to strike the enemy's rear rather than attacking head-on. Ieyasu dismissed the caution as cowardice. Snow fell steadily through the whole engagement. Nobunaga's reinforcing officers broke and fled almost as soon as the fighting started. One of Ieyasu's flanks collapsed under fresh Takeda reserves, and by twilight his entire line was in retreat. In the chaos, Ieyasu himself very nearly died. A retainer named Natsume Jurozaimon Masayoshi rode out with 24 men specifically to die in his place, physically grabbed the bridle of Ieyasu's horse, and forced him to flee toward Hamamatsu Castle, while his small escort stayed behind to be wiped out covering the retreat. Ieyasu made it back with only 5 men beside him, narrowly dodging an arrow along the way. What he did next became one of the most retold moments of his career. Rather than barricade the castle gates against the pursuing Takeda vanguard, Ieyasu ordered them thrown wide open with torches blazing on both sides, reasoning that a frightened man hides behind locked doors, and an enemy who sees an undefended, illuminated castle gate will assume it's a trap rather than an opportunity. It worked. The pursuing Takeda generals, suspicious of the open gates and the eerily calm scene inside, held back rather than press the attack. Ieyasu then walked into his quarters, ate 3 bowls of rice in hot water, and fell asleep snoring loudly enough that the whole household could hear it, just hours after barely escaping with his life. Shingen pressed his advantage and laid siege to Noda Castle the following year, but the campaign never produced the knockout blow it seemed destined to deliver. Shingen died during that siege. Popular legend claims a sniper shot him while his guard was down, a dramatic story that's made its way into plenty of retellings since. The better supported version, the one most historians favor, is less cinematic but more human. Shingen died of illness, and his son Katsuyori kept the death secret for as long as he could, trying to hold the clan together before word got out and ambitious neighbors smelled weakness. 6 years after that battlefield reprieve, Ieyasu's own household produced a tragedy no enemy army could have engineered for him. His wife, Lady Tsukiyama, had lived apart from him for years, embittered over her father's death and resentful that her son Nobuyasu got along well with his own wife, who happened to be Nobunaga's daughter. Tsukiyama wanted grandsons, not the granddaughters her daughter-in-law had given the family, and out of spite, she arranged a second consort for her son, the daughter of a Takeda retainer, recently disgraced and available. That move backfired completely. Nobuyasu's original wife became the bitter enemy of her own mother-in-law and started looking for a way to destroy her. Tsukiyama gave her the opening herself. She'd grown close to a Chinese physician named Genkei, far closer than a doctor-patient relationship usually required, and used him as a go-between to plot with Takeda Katsuyori directly, proposing that he attack and exterminate both Ieyasu and Nobunaga in exchange for marrying her off afterward to one of his own generals. 12 letters laying out the entire scheme made their way, through a maid's sister, straight into the hands of Nobunaga's daughter, who handed them to her father. A Tokugawa retainer with a personal grudge against Nobuyasu made sure Nobunaga believed the young man was equally guilty, rather than simply caught in his mother's plot, and Nobunaga demanded that Nobuyasu be ordered to take his own life. Ieyasu, unwilling to risk his alliance with Nobunaga over it, agreed. A retainer was sent to kill Lady Tsukiyama directly, and she was buried at the temple of Sairaiji. Nobuyasu's turn came that September. Ieyasu sent Hattori Hanzo, the same retainer who'd once stormed a castle on his behalf, along with a second man, Amakata Michitsuna, to see that the sentence was carried out. Before the ritual cut, Nobuyasu insisted there had been no truth to the conspiracy charge, and that history would eventually prove its slander. He asked Hanzo, his friend, to serve as his second, the one who delivers the killing blow once the cut is made. Hanzo couldn't do it. He was so overcome with emotion that Amakata had to take his place and finish it himself, using a blade forged by Muramasa, a swordsmith whose work the Tokugawa house considered cursed ever after. When Ieyasu heard how it had gone, he said simply, "Even such a devil as Hanzo does not care to cut off the head of his master." Among the Tokugawa retainers, a contemporary folk song had nicknamed Hanzo, Oni Hanzo, Devil Hanzo for his battlefield ferocity, a title that sounds almost like mockery next to the story of the one knight he couldn't bring himself to kill. Nobuyasu was 20 years old. Ieyasu was 37, and had just buried both his wife and his eldest son inside the same month, on the word of a betrayal he never fully got to investigate. The Takeda threat that had cost Ieyasu his son eventually destroyed itself. Nobunaga's decisive victory at Nagashino in 1575 broke Takeda Katsuyori's army, and Ieyasu spent years afterward patiently pushing into Takeda territory, until Katsuyori was finally defeated at the Battle of Tenmokuzan in 1582, with help from Nobunaga's son. Ieyasu received the conquered Takeda provinces of Kai and Shinano as his reward, and by deliberately staying out of the power struggle that followed when Nobunaga's general Shibata Katsuie clashed with Toyotomi Hideyoshi over succession, he avoided making new enemies at the worst possible moment. Knowing when not to get involved was already one of his sharpest political instincts. It very nearly didn't matter, because everything Ieyasu had built was about to be tested by an event he had absolutely no control over. In the summer of 1582, Nobunaga invited Ieyasu to tour the recently conquered region around Kai, showed him around his territory with genuine warmth, and the two men spent 6 days together before Ieyasu moved on to see the sights of Kyoto and the port city of Sakai. He traveled light, accompanied by only a handful of his most trusted retainers, Sakai Tadatsugu, Ishikawa Kazumasa, Ii Naomasa, Sakakibara Yasumasa, Okubo Tadachika, and Honda Tadakatsu. He was, for the only time in years, far from his own territory and almost entirely undefended. On the 30th day of the 5th month, word reached him through a merchant friend named Chaya Shirojiro. Nobunaga's own general, Akechi Mitsuhide, had revolted, surrounded Nobunaga at the temple of Honno-ji, and set it ablaze. Nobunaga had committed seppuku inside the burning building rather than be captured. His heir died fighting nearby. Ieyasu's first instinct wasn't strategic. It was to march straight to a temple in Kyoto and end his own life there, following his lord into death as an act of loyalty. His retainer Hasegawa Togoro talked him out of it, arguing that dying quietly in Kyoto honored nobody, but marching home, raising an army, and avenging Nobunaga properly would actually mean something. The problem was that home was very far away, and the country between Sakai and Mikawa was not Ieyasu's territory. It belonged to nobody and to everybody, full of opportunistic bandits who had no loyalty to keep them from killing a small, exposed party of samurai for whatever they were carrying. One of Ieyasu's companions, a retainer named Aneyama Baisetsu, split off to take a different route home and was ambushed and killed by highwaymen before he ever reached safety. The rest pressed forward, with Honda Tadakatsu brandishing his famous halberd, nicknamed the Dragonfly Cutter, to intimidate frightened locals into giving directions, while Chaya Shirojiro handed out money to anyone willing to talk. At river crossings with no ferries, they improvised with brushwood boats and then smashed the boats afterward so nobody could follow. At Hachimanyama, several hundred bandits confronted the group directly, and Honda's party fought them off. The final stretch ran through Iga province, hostile and unfamiliar territory to everyone in the group except one man, Hattori Hanzo, the same retainer who'd once raided a castle for Ieyasu and later failed to carry out his son's execution, was a native of Iga and knew the land intimately. There was an unexpected stroke of luck buried in the danger. The year before, Nobunaga had ordered a brutal extermination campaign against the local samurai of Iga, and the survivors of that massacre had fled into Tokugawa territory, where Ieyasu had treated them kindly rather than turn them away. When word spread that Ieyasu himself was now passing through their home province in genuine danger, several hundred of those same Iga survivors rallied to escort and protect him, repaying a debt nobody had asked them to honor. Guided home by the very people Nobunaga's cruelty had displaced, Ieyasu reached the small port of Shiroko and escaped by ship, arranged by another merchant ally, finally safe on his own side of the water. That harrowing journey is remembered in Japan as the Iga Crossing, and it's the kind of story that should be impossible to leave out of any honest account of Ieyasu's life, the single closest he ever came to dying with nothing he'd built yet finished. He survived it, rebuilt his strength, and found himself navigating an entirely new balance of power once he returned. By 1584, Ieyasu controlled 5 provinces, and his growing influence put him on a collision course with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's other surviving general, in the Komaki-Nagakute campaign. The fighting produced no decisive winner. Both sides eventually negotiated a truce, and the two men turned their combined strength against Japan's last fully independent daimyo, the Hojo clan, whose century-long reign ended after Ieyasu and Hideyoshi besieged their stronghold together. By the time that campaign concluded, Ieyasu had become the second most powerful lord in the entire country. Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in 1598 at Fushimi Castle at the age of 62, leaving behind a 5-year-old son, Hideyori, as his designated heir. Desperate to protect that succession, Hideyoshi had appointed a council of 5 regents from his most trusted vassals to govern in his son's name until the boy came of age. Tokugawa Ieyasu was one of the 5. It was, in hindsight, exactly the kind of arrangement that depends entirely on the regents actually trusting each other. And they didn't. In April of 1600, while that uneasy regency was already fraying, a Dutch trading fleet that had left Rotterdam 2 years earlier finally limped into Japanese waters. 5 ships had set out together. By the time one of them, the Liefde, reached the Japanese coast, the other 4 were gone, sunk, captured by the Spanish or Portuguese, or scattered back around the southern tip of South America. The Liefde's surviving crew included an Englishman named William Adams, who had originally signed on as pilot major for a different ship in the fleet, before ending up aboard the lone survivor. Adams had a personal history that mattered more than it might have seemed at first. Years earlier, he'd commanded an English vessel supplying Francis Drake's fleet during England's war against the Spanish Armada, which meant he arrived in Japan already deeply suspicious of Spanish and Portuguese ambitions in the region. The Liefde herself carried 500 matchlock guns, 5,000 cast-iron cannonballs, 300 rounds of chain shot, and several hundred fire arrows, a small arsenal that landed directly in the hands of a man about to need every weapon he could get. Ieyasu confiscated the ship under Japanese law and brought Adams in for questioning. According to Adams' own account, Ieyasu's first real question to him wasn't about religion or trade. It was whether his country was currently at war. Adams said yes, against Spain and Portugal, and only after that did Ieyasu ask about his faith, receiving the safely diplomatic answer that Adams believed in the creator of heaven and earth. Ieyasu recognized in Adams something genuinely useful, a knowledgeable, reliable foreign advisor who had no stake in Catholic Iberian politics and a personal grudge against the powers Ieyasu was already wary of. He kept Adams close for the rest of his reign. The same year that fleet arrived, the fragile regency collapsed entirely. Ishida Mitsunari, who had once served Hideyoshi loyally, organized the anti-Ieyasu faction among the remaining daimyo. Ieyasu marched east first, on the pretext of disciplining the Uesugi clan over suspicious fortress building, a maneuver designed as much to draw his rivals into the open as to punish anyone, and he took his time doing it, stopping to enjoy the scenery at Kanazawa and Kamakura along the way. When Ishida formally declared open rebellion in the west, Ieyasu turned his full attention there immediately, releasing any allied retainer whose family was held hostage in Osaka to switch sides if they genuinely wished to. None of them did. At a war council, his commanders agreed the Western Front mattered more than the Eastern one, and while Allied forces kept the Uesugi pinned down and unable to help Ishida, Ieyasu sent two mobile divisions, roughly 16,000 and 18,000 men, racing ahead to seize the two main roads into Kyoto before the enemy could block them. The two armies finally collided at Sekigahara in October of 1600, in a battle that turned not just on tactics, but on betrayal. Several of Ishida's own allied commanders defected mid-fight, and the battle that followed broke his forces decisively. Mitsunari fled, was captured within days, and was executed. Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged the single most powerful man in Japan. 3 years later, in 1603, at 60 years old, the emperor personally granted Ieyasu the title of shogun. He had outlived nearly every great rival who'd defined his era. Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, all gone, while he remained. He spent his remaining years consolidating the Tokugawa shogunate and shaping the Edo period that would follow, a long stretch of internal peace and economic growth after a century of nearly continuous war. He oversaw early diplomatic relations with the Netherlands, Spain, and England, advised throughout by William Adams, who remained fluent in Japanese, openly Protestant, and personally useful in negotiating foreign trade. Starting around 1609, Ieyasu began deliberately scaling back Japan's engagement with European powers, though the shogunate still granted the Dutch East India Company a trading post. And in 1614, growing suspicion of Spanish territorial ambition led him to issue an edict expelling Christian missionaries and banning the practice of their religion outright, a policy Adams himself helped shape from his position as the shogun's advisor on all things Western. Only one real threat remained to Ieyasu's authority: Toyotomi Hideyori, Hideyoshi's son, now grown and residing in Osaka Castle with the support of samurai who still considered him Japan's legitimate ruler. When Ieyasu ordered Hideyori to vacate the castle, Hideyori's allies refused and rallied troops behind its walls instead. Hideyori appealed to every daimyo in the country for help, and not one of them answered. He was left to defend the castle with roughly 90,000 freelance samurai who had nowhere else to go, while close to 94,000 Tokugawa troops converged on Osaka from every direction, Ieyasu leading one army and his son Hidetada the other. The castle itself was almost absurdly strong, nearly 9 miles of outer walls bristling with cannon, including 2 enormous pieces nicknamed Taro and Jiro mounted above the main gate, reportedly the largest guns in the country. Neither side pushed hard for an outright assault during what came to be called the Winter Campaign, and a fragile peace held for a while afterward. It didn't last. Fighting resumed the following year in the Summer Campaign, and by the autumn of 1615, the castle fell for good. Hideyoshi and his mother, Lady Yodo, died in the fighting along with nearly every defender inside. The Toyotomi line that Hideyoshi had sacrificed his own adopted heir to protect ended there, and with it, the last organized resistance to Tokugawa rule anywhere in Japan. By then, Ieyasu was an old man who had spent decades obsessively managing his own health, a habit that made sense for someone who'd buried nearly every contemporary he'd ever fought alongside or against. He ate a frugal diet, avoided excess of any kind, lived an active outdoor life, and compounded his own medicines, keeping a personal cabinet of pills he'd mixed himself, with names like the Manbyoen, the pill for a myriad ills, and a kidney remedy he simply called number 8 because that's which drawer he kept it in. Popular legend has long claimed he died from eating tempura, fried bream prepared in a style he'd never tried before. He did eat that dish not long before his final decline, and it did upset him, but the symptoms his physicians actually recorded point to something else entirely. Stomach cancer. Slow and unglamorous. Nothing like the dramatic last meal story that's attached itself to him since. Ieyasu died in 1616 at the age of 73. His death had been rumored in Edo for months beforehand, false reports circulating and getting denied so many times that when the real news finally arrived, it was almost indistinguishable from the rumors that had preceded it. 3 days before his final illness took hold, held up by heavy rain on the road to Shizuoka, he passed the time having a scholar lecture him on Confucius and the virtues of loyalty and filial piety, in character literally until the end. His last major project was personally overseeing the printing of a historical text, the Gunshojiyo, using newly cast type, work he never lived to see completed. What happened after his death is the part most retellings leave out entirely. Ieyasu didn't just found a ruling dynasty that would govern Japan for the next 250 years. He arranged, before he died, to be worshipped as a god. He was deified as the Great Gongen, a Shinto Buddhist divine reincarnation, and shrines to him in that capacity spread across the entire country. His headquarters shrine still stands at Nikko, one of the most visited religious sites in Japan, built specifically to honor a man who had spent his entire childhood as someone else's hostage and ended it as something closer to a living legend than a mortal ruler. He was capable of great loyalty and also outright betrayal. He could be patient to the point of stillness and ruthless the moment patience stopped paying off. He fought through some of the bloodiest decades in Japanese history, watched nearly every rival who'd once outranked him destroy themselves through ambition he refused to share, and ended up shogun not because he was the most brilliant general of his era, but because he was willing to wait, absorb, and survive long after everyone louder than him had already burned out. The Tokugawa shogunate he built would last until 1868. Almost everyone who tried to kill him along the way is forgotten by name. He is not.